In the early days of World War II, as the world plunged into chaos, countless stories of bravery and sacrifice went unnoticed. Among them was the story of Ruth Sanders, a woman whose courage would quietly shape the lives of hundreds on the front lines. Born in a small American town, Ruth grew up in a household that valued resilience, responsibility, and a quiet sense of duty. Little did anyone know that this unassuming woman would later step into a role that demanded more than most could imagine. Ruth's early life had not hinted at the extraordinary path that awaited her. She spent her youth helping in the local community, tending to neighbors in need, and supporting her family in times of hardship. When news of the war reached her town, Ruth, like many young Americans, felt a profound sense of responsibility. The United States was still on the edge of involvement, yet she understood that the world was changing and she had a part to play. When the call came for volunteers to assist in medical and logistical support for the troops overseas, Ruth didn't hesitate. She joined a program that trained women to serve close to the front lines, a dangerous and demanding position that required not only skill, but unwavering resolve. The training was grueling. Long hours of drills, medical procedures, emergency simulations, and learning to navigate conflict zones with precision. Ruth approached each challenge with determination, earning the respect of instructors and peers alike. Her first assignment brought her to the outskirts of a war-torn European city. The scene that greeted her was a stark contrast to the quiet streets of her hometown. Buildings lay in ruins, the air was thick with smoke and tension, and the cries of those affected by the fighting echoed in every alley. Yet, amidst this chaos, Ruth found clarity in her purpose. She understood that every action, no matter how small, could save lives and preserve hope in the most desperate of circumstances. Ruth quickly proved herself indispensable. Her ability to organize supply lines, coordinate medical aid, and provide comfort to the wounded earned her recognition among officers and fellow volunteers. But it wasn't just her efficiency that stood out. It was her empathy. She listened to the fears of soldiers, reassured them in moments of despair, and often worked tirelessly through nights without rest, ensuring that no one felt forgotten. Stories of her heroism began to circulate quietly among those who witnessed her work. Soldiers who had lost hope found solace in Ruth's presence, and fellow volunteers drew inspiration from her unwavering commitment. Despite the danger, Ruth remained on the front lines, understanding that her role was not one of glory, but of necessity. Every shipment she organized, every life she touched, was a small victory against the overwhelming shadow of war. Yet, Ruth's journey was not without personal sacrifice. Letters from home reminded her of the family she missed, friends who were unaware of the true dangers she faced, and a world that continued on as if unaware of the silent battles waged by women like her. Each day brought the weight of responsibility, but Ruth never wavered. She believed that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act in spite of it. As weeks turned into months, Ruth's impact became undeniable. Hospitals ran more efficiently, supplies reached their destinations on time, and morale among the troops who had once felt forgotten. Her quiet leadership created ripples that extended far beyond the immediate battlefield, demonstrating the critical role women played in shaping the course of the war. Ruth Sanders was more than a volunteer. She was a lifeline. Her story, though largely hidden from the public eye, represents the countless women whose contributions were pivotal in sustaining the war effort. In the shadows of history, Ruth's courage shines as a testament to what can be achieved through determination, empathy, and an unwavering commitment to duty. And yet, this was only the beginning of her journey. The challenges that lay ahead would test her resolve in ways she had never imagined, and the choices she would make on the front lines would forever define the legacy of Ruth Sanders, hidden heroine of the war. The night Ruth Sanders arrived at the makeshift field hospital, the sounds of war were unrelenting. Shells echoed in the distance, and the air was thick with dust and fear. Inside the tent, wounded soldiers lay in rows, their faces etched with exhaustion, pain, and uncertainty. Ruth's heart clenched at the sight, but she knew that panic would serve no one. She had a mission, and she would carry it with every ounce of strength she had. Her first task was simple in description, but monumental in effect: organize the chaos. Supplies had been scattered, schedules were mismatched, and morale was dangerously low. With calm precision, Ruth assessed the situation. She delegated responsibilities to her fellow volunteers, coordinated with the few doctors who were barely keeping up, and began cataloging the endless piles of medical kits. Every action was deliberate, every instruction clear. Within hours, the hospital tent, which had been a place of confusion, transformed into a functional lifeline. Yet the war had no mercy. The next wave of wounded arrived unexpectedly, transported from a nearby skirmish. Their injuries were severe, and panic threatened to overtake even the most experienced nurses. Ruth stepped in, guiding volunteers, performing triage herself, and offering words of encouragement. One soldier, barely conscious, grasped her hand and whispered, "Thank you for keeping me alive." In that moment, Ruth realized that her presence meant more than efficiency. It meant hope. Days turned into a blur of adrenaline and exhaustion. Ruth rarely slept, sometimes catching only a few stolen minutes on a cold cot. She witnessed the horrors of battle firsthand. Men who had fought valiantly, yet lay broken. Families torn apart by sudden loss, and the constant reminder that the war showed no favoritism. Still, Ruth pressed on, understanding that her work was part of something far greater than herself. Every life she saved, every injury she treated, became a quiet rebellion against the devastation surrounding them. But Ruth was not invincible. Fatigue gnawed at her, and the weight of responsibility often pressed so heavily on her shoulders that she felt she might collapse. Letters from home, tucked safely in her pocket, reminded her of the life she had left behind. Her mother's gentle words, her younger brother's teasing notes, the warmth of her hometown streets. These memories fueled her determination, pushing her to continue despite the relentless pace of the front lines. In the midst of chaos, Ruth's leadership began to shine beyond the hospital tent. Soldiers who had once doubted the capabilities of women in war now looked to her for guidance. Volunteers who were weary or hesitant found renewed strength in her unwavering commitment. Ruth had a way of inspiring through action rather than words, a quiet force that demanded respect without demanding attention. Then came an evening that would test her like never before. A sudden bombing raid hit nearby, sending shrapnel and debris into the surrounding area. The wounded were scattered, the tent partially damaged, and panic surged through those around her. Ruth's response was immediate. She directed volunteers to shield the injured, coordinated emergency evacuations, and worked alongside doctors to stabilize those at greatest risk. In the midst of chaos, she remained a pillar of calm, a beacon for everyone relying on her strength. Word of Ruth Sanders' bravery began to spread, though she never sought recognition. Fellow nurses and soldiers spoke of her courage in hushed tones, of her tireless work that saved countless lives, and of her remarkable ability to maintain composure when everything else seemed lost. She became a symbol, not of fame, but of resilience, a hidden heroine whose impact was felt deeply by those she served. Yet, even as her reputation grew quietly, Ruth faced moments of doubt. Could one person truly make a difference amidst such overwhelming destruction? Could courage survive when surrounded by so much suffering? Each night, as she tended to her patients, she wrestled with these questions, finding solace only in the knowledge that every small act mattered. Every bandaged wound, every reassuring smile, every organized supply meant someone had a chance to live, to hope, to continue. Ruth's journey was far from over. The war would demand even more from her, testing not only her skill, but her very sense of humanity. Yet, in those early weeks on the front lines, she had already proven that courage was not reserved for soldiers on the battlefield. It lived in the quiet, determined acts of women like her, who refused to let fear dictate their actions, who chose compassion and bravery over surrender, who became the hidden backbone of a world at war. And in the eyes of those she helped, Ruth Sanders was no longer just a volunteer. She was hope incarnate, a force that whispered through the chaos, reminding everyone that even in the darkest times, courage and humanity could prevail. By the time winter settled over the European front, Ruth Sanders had become inseparable from the daily rhythm of the hospital. Snow blanketed the shattered city outside, yet inside the tents, life and death continued in a relentless cycle. Soldiers arrived with frostbitten limbs, deep wounds, and eyes hollowed by fatigue. Ruth moved among them with precision, her hands steady, her mind calculating the fastest way to save another life. Each breath she took carried the weight of responsibility, yet she never faltered. It wasn't just the physical toll that tested her, it was the emotional. Every soldier's story weighed heavily on her heart. Young men who had barely seen the world before the war now faced its harshest truths. Ruth listened to their whispered confessions in the dead of night, stories of homes destroyed, families lost, futures uncertain. She offered what comfort she could, a gentle touch, a quiet word, or simply a presence that said, "You are not alone." These small acts, unnoticed by the world outside, carried more power than any medal or recognition. One evening, a particularly grievous wave of casualties arrived from a nearby battle. The hospital tent was overflowing, volunteers were exhausted, supplies dwindling, and doctors were at the edge of despair. Ruth, though equally drained, refused to yield. She organized the incoming patients with meticulous care, assigning beds, prioritizing care, and improvising when necessary. At one point, a young soldier gasped, barely conscious, and Ruth held him gently, whispering encouragement as she stabilized his breathing. Moments like these defined her presence, calm, unwavering, and unshakable. Despite the intensity of the work, Ruth never let the grim reality diminish her humanity. She would sneak small comforts where possible, a warm blanket for a shivering patient, a word of encouragement for a frightened volunteer, a scrap of chocolate that she had saved for herself shared discreetly with someone in need. It was in these small gestures that Ruth's true courage shone. She reminded everyone that even in the shadow of war, humanity could endure. As word spread through the ranks, soldiers began to rely on her, not only for care, but for reassurance. Many had lost their families, their homes, and their sense of hope. Ruth became a symbol of stability, a reminder that someone cared deeply enough to risk everything for them. Yet she never sought attention or praise. Her work was not about recognition, it was about survival, compassion, and the quiet fulfillment of duty. Amidst the cold nights and endless days, Ruth found moments to reflect. Letters from home reminded her of the life she had paused, the simple joys, the laughter of friends, the comfort of family. These memories were bittersweet, fueling both her resolve and a quiet sorrow. She understood that her presence on the front lines was temporary, yet the lives she touched would carry a piece of her courage forward long after the war ended. Challenges escalated with the arrival of new threats. Air raids became frequent, enemy shells drew closer, and the hospital faced constant danger. One night, during a particularly fierce bombardment, Ruth led her team to secure the wounded, navigating through falling debris and chaos without hesitation. Every life saved during that night added to her growing reputation among soldiers and fellow volunteers alike. Stories of her bravery circulated quietly, whispered among those who had witnessed her in action. Through it all, Ruth maintained a delicate balance of strength and empathy. She recognized fear in others and knew how to soothe it without diminishing the gravity of their reality. Volunteers followed her example, adopting her methods, her calm demeanor, and her insistence that every life, no matter how wounded, mattered. It was in this ripple effect that Ruth's hidden influence grew, an invisible thread binding courage, care, and humanity across the front lines. Yet the war had a way of testing the limits of even the strongest hearts. Ruth faced moments when despair threatened to overwhelm her, when she lost patience despite her tireless efforts, when exhaustion clouded her judgment, or when letters from home brought news of personal loss. In those moments, she clung to a simple belief that the work she did, though unseen by the world, mattered more than comfort, recognition, or safety. By the end of her second winter on the front lines, Ruth Sanders had become more than a caregiver. She was a quiet force of hope. Soldiers called her their angel, volunteers leaned on her guidance, and even the most hardened officers respected her presence. She remained humble, unwavering, and steadfast, demonstrating that heroism did not always roar. Sometimes it worked silently, persistently, and invisibly, leaving a legacy that would resonate long after the guns fell silent. And yet the coming months would demand even more of Ruth. The war was far from over, and her courage would be tested in ways she had never imagined. But one thing was certain. Ruth Sanders had already proven that even a single determined woman could make an indelible mark on the front lines of history. Spring arrived, but the war showed no mercy. Bombs and gunfire continued to echo across the distant hills, and yet Ruth Sanders' tent remained a place where order and hope clung stubbornly to life. The snow had melted, leaving muddy streets and broken roads outside. But inside, Ruth organized, planned, and cared with a precision that inspired everyone around her. Volunteers looked to her for guidance. Soldiers leaned on her courage, and even the officers could not ignore the quiet power of her presence. Ruth's day began before dawn. She moved through the rows of cots, checking each patient with meticulous care. Some wounds were minor, others were catastrophic, the result of battles that no one could ever truly forget. She treated each soldier with the same attention, the same dedication, knowing that even the smallest gesture could spark hope in a weary soul. A gentle touch, a calm word, a brief smile, these were her tools, as vital as bandages and antiseptics. One afternoon, news arrived that a nearby supply convoy had been ambushed. Vital medical supplies had been destroyed, leaving the hospital dangerously low. Panic began to ripple among the volunteers, but Ruth's calm voice cut through the fear. She reorganized what remained, rationed supplies efficiently, and dispatched a small team to retrieve any salvageable materials. Every action was swift, deliberate, and calculated, her mind working faster than anyone else's in the chaos. The hospital survived the crisis, and the volunteers looked on with quiet awe at her ability to turn potential disaster into managed order. But Ruth's heroism was not limited to logistics. Soldiers spoke of her bedside presence as if it were a balm for the soul. She listened when they spoke of fear, grief, and memories they wished they could forget. She understood that healing was not only physical, it was emotional and mental. A wounded soldier once whispered through cracked lips, "I thought I was done for, but you made me feel human again." Ruth smiled softly and moved on, never pausing to take credit, never allowing herself to dwell. The work demanded every ounce of focus. As the weeks passed, Ruth began mentoring new volunteers, teaching them not only medical procedures, but the essence of courage and compassion. She reminded them that fear was natural, that mistakes could happen, but that persistence and heart could make all the difference. Those who worked with her began to emulate her calm authority, her empathy, and her tireless work ethic. The tent became more than a hospital. It became a place where hope was carefully nurtured, one act at a time. Yet, amidst the rhythm of her duties, Ruth faced personal moments of doubt. Letters from home were sporadic, sometimes carrying news of illness, loss, or hardship among her family. Each letter was a reminder of what she had left behind, a tug on her heart she could not ignore. But she held firm, believing that the sacrifices she made were necessary, and that the lives she saved were worth every moment of longing and fatigue. Then came a challenge unlike any she had faced before. A sudden influx of casualties arrived from a fierce skirmish just miles from the hospital. The wounded were more numerous and more severely injured than any Ruth had seen. Volunteers scrambled, supplies dwindled, and the noise of urgency filled the tent. Ruth's eyes scanned the chaos, her mind calculating, prioritizing, and assigning tasks without hesitation. She moved from cot to cot, stabilizing, comforting, and encouraging, each action reinforcing the invisible thread of order she had woven among the chaos. Hours turned into an exhausting night. Ruth refused to leave her post, staying beside the most critical patients, monitoring vital signs, adjusting treatments, and whispering reassurance. Sleep was a luxury she could not afford, but in her exhaustion she found a strange clarity. She was exactly where she was needed most, and that knowledge fueled her determination. By dawn, the wave of wounded had been stabilized. The volunteers, exhausted but inspired, looked at Ruth with quiet reverence. She had guided them through chaos, transformed despair into organized action, and reminded everyone that courage could persist even when surrounded by devastation. Soldiers whispered her name, calling her their guardian, a quiet hero whose impact stretched far beyond what anyone outside the tent could ever see. And yet, Ruth knew the war was far from over. Each day brought new challenges, new lives to save, and new tests of courage. But for every hardship, there was a moment of triumph, a glimpse of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest times, a determined heart could make a difference. Ruth Sanders had become more than a volunteer, more than a caregiver. She was a symbol of resilience, a hidden heroine, shaping the front lines with every action, every choice, and every act of compassion. The war raged on, relentless and unforgiving, but Ruth Sanders had become a constant amid the chaos. Every morning as dawn broke over the battered city, she walked through the tented hospital, her eyes scanning for even the smallest signs of need. Each patient was a world unto themselves, some silent, some terrified, some barely clinging to life. Ruth treated them all with the same unwavering attention, knowing that in a war that demanded nothing but destruction, her touch could bring fragments of humanity back to those who had lost it. Her reputation among the soldiers was growing, though she never sought it. Whispers of "the woman who never tires" and "the angel of the front lines" spread quietly, carried by those whose lives she had touched. Yet Ruth remained focused, never allowing the praise to distract her from the work at hand. For her, heroism was not measured in words, medals, or recognition. It was measured in every life she helped sustain, every moment of hope she preserved, and every ounce of courage she inspired in others. One particular day, a young volunteer arrived, wide-eyed and inexperienced, thrust into the harsh reality of the front lines. Ruth immediately took her under her wing, teaching her not only the medical procedures, but the subtle lessons that could mean the difference between life and death. "Courage isn't the absence of fear," Ruth said softly as they moved from patient to patient. "It's moving forward, even when fear is all you feel." The words, simple yet profound, carried a weight that no textbook could ever convey. The challenges Ruth faced were never merely logistical. Emotional strain pressed heavily on everyone in the tent. Soldiers carried grief, trauma, and fear in their eyes, and volunteers struggled to reconcile the horrors they witnessed with the ideals that had brought them here. Ruth became the anchor in this storm. She listened, comforted, and guided, her calm presence reassuring those who were on the brink of despair. Every life she touched was a reminder that hope could survive, even in the darkest hours. As spring deepened, new waves of wounded continued to arrive from increasingly dangerous fronts. Ruth's stamina was tested relentlessly. Nights were short, sleep fleeting, and meals often skipped. Yet she persevered, driven by a quiet, unyielding sense of duty. Her hands became instruments of healing, her mind a map of strategy, and her heart a reservoir of compassion. She moved like a force of nature, flowing seamlessly from task to task, patient to patient, volunteer to volunteer, ensuring that no one felt lost or forgotten. Among the chaos, Ruth also found herself mediating conflicts between soldiers and volunteers. Tensions ran high in such an environment, tempers flaring over exhaustion, fear, and grief. Ruth's wisdom and diplomacy often prevented situations from escalating. She reminded everyone of their shared purpose, of the lives at stake, and of the quiet power that each person carried when they chose courage over despair. Her words were not loud, but they were heard, and they carried weight beyond any rank or title. Then came the arrival of a critically injured officer. His injuries were severe, and time was against them. Ruth took the lead, directing the volunteers with swift precision, performing critical procedures and keeping the man alive through sheer skill and determination. Hours passed like minutes, each second a test of endurance, knowledge, and nerve. When the officer finally stabilized, the tent erupted in quiet relief, but Ruth barely noticed. There was no time for celebration, only the next patient, the next challenge, the next life to safeguard. Letters from home continued to arrive sporadically, each one a reminder of the life Ruth had temporarily set aside. They brought moments of joy, longing, and sorrow. Her family unaware of the depth of her struggle, the danger she faced daily, and the magnitude of the lives she was shaping. She folded each letter carefully, drawing strength from the words, but never allowing herself to linger. Every moment counted, and every life depended on her focus. By the end of this long spring day, Ruth Sanders had once again proven her extraordinary resilience. Soldiers and volunteers alike had witnessed her unshakable courage, her tireless work ethic, and her uncanny ability to bring order and hope to chaos. And yet, Ruth remained humble, steadfast, and singularly focused on her mission: to save lives, inspire courage, and remind the world, even if only in the smallest, quietest ways, that humanity
Summer
could endure,
arrived,
even in the
and
darkest
with it,
hours.
the intensity of the front lines grew. The sun scorched the ruins of the city. Yet inside Ruth Sanders' hospital tent, life and death continued their relentless rhythm. Soldiers arrived exhausted, burned by both sun and battle, each carrying wounds that demanded immediate attention. Ruth moved through the chaos with an uncanny focus, her hands steady, her mind calculating every move, every priority. She was no longer simply a volunteer. She was a force of resilience that the soldiers and volunteers relied upon without question. The days blurred together in a haze of bandages, antiseptics, and whispered words of reassurance. Ruth rarely allowed herself a moment of rest, knowing that every second lost could mean a life lost. The wounded looked to her not only for care, but for hope, a reminder that someone truly cared amidst the destruction. Soldiers who had once been skeptical of women's roles in war now whispered her name with reverence, calling her their guiding light in the midst of darkness. A sudden crisis erupted one afternoon. A convoy carrying crucial medical supplies had been ambushed, leaving the hospital dangerously low on everything from bandages to essential medications. Panic rippled through the volunteers, some on the brink of despair. Ruth, however, took immediate control. She assessed the remaining resources, reorganized supplies, and devised a plan to stretch every ounce of what they had. Her decisiveness kept the hospital operational, preventing what could have been a disaster. Volunteers watched in awe as she transformed panic into precise, life-saving action. But Ruth's true strength lay beyond logistics. She had a gift for connecting with those around her, for seeing the humanity in soldiers broken by fear and pain. A young private, barely conscious after a mortar attack, clung to her hand and whispered his fear of dying alone. Ruth knelt beside him, offering not just medical care, but calm assurance, speaking softly, "You're not alone. I'm here." That moment, repeated countless times, defined her impact. She gave hope when all else seemed lost. The emotional weight of her work was heavy. Each life saved was a victory, but each loss carried a deep ache. Ruth witnessed death in ways few could comprehend, yet she refused to let despair take hold. She reminded herself that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. Every patient she tended, every volunteer she guided, was a testament to the enduring power of human determination. Among the volunteers, Ruth became a mentor, quietly shaping the next generation of women who had answered the call to serve. She taught them the importance of composure, empathy, and precision, showing that heroism was as much about attitude as it was about skill. the tent evolved into a haven of order and hope, a place where even the most traumatized soldiers found comfort and care. Yet the war would not relent. That night, news arrived of an enemy raid closer than anyone expected. Explosions shook the ground, debris rained down, and panic threatened to overwhelm the hospital. Ruth sprang into action, directing volunteers, moving patients to safety, and performing critical procedures under unimaginable pressure. Her calm authority and quick thinking saved countless lives that night, cementing her reputation as a hidden pillar of strength on the front lines. Through it all, letters from home were her lifeline. They reminded her of what she had left behind: family, friends, and a world untouched by the horrors she faced daily. She drew strength from those words, even as she focused entirely on the lives in front of her. Every day, every action, every choice was a testament to her belief that even in the darkest moments, one person could make a difference. By the end of summer, Ruth Sanders had become more than a caregiver or a volunteer. She had become a symbol, a quiet force of courage, compassion, and resilience. Soldiers whispered her name, volunteers emulated her methods, and the officers, who once doubted the power of women on the front lines, now regarded her with respect and admiration. Her work, though hidden from the wider world, had created a ripple effect that would shape the war effort in profound ways. And yet, Ruth knew the hardest months were still ahead. The battles would grow fiercer, the casualties higher, and the moral and emotional tests even more grueling. But one truth remained unshaken: Ruth Sanders, hidden heroine of the front lines, would continue to stand, to guide, and to inspire. A beacon of hope amid the relentless storm of war. Autumn crept over the war-torn city, painting the rubble in muted gold and brown. But inside the hospital tents, life remained a relentless storm. Ruth Sanders had grown into her role in ways even she had not imagined. Each morning she rose before dawn, her mind already racing through the endless tasks ahead. Soldiers arrived with wounds both visible and hidden, each carrying stories of fear, loss, and courage. Ruth met them all with steady hands, unwavering focus, and a heart that refused to let despair take hold. The days were long, and exhaustion pressed against her relentlessly. Volunteers sometimes faltered, weighed down by the enormity of the work. But Ruth's presence grounded them. She moved with quiet authority, delegating tasks, teaching procedures, and offering moments of comfort that lifted the spirits of both patients and staff. She understood that the smallest gestures, a touch on the shoulder, a reassuring glance, a whispered word, could sustain a person when everything else seemed lost. One evening, a young soldier arrived, barely conscious, his uniform soaked with blood. Panic flared among the volunteers, but Ruth's calm voice cut through the fear. She assessed his condition, directed the team with precision, and worked tirelessly to stabilize him. Hours later, when he finally drew a steady breath, the volunteers allowed themselves a brief sigh of relief. Ruth, however, moved on immediately, aware that the next crisis was already waiting. It was not just the physical challenges that tested her. The emotional weight of the front lines pressed heavily on her heart. She saw grief in every face, trauma in every expression, and yet she met each person with compassion. Soldiers confided in her, sharing memories they wished they could forget, fears they had no one else to voice. Ruth listened, absorbing their pain, offering not advice or judgment, but presence, a simple yet profound act of humanity in the midst of chaos. As the weeks passed, Ruth's role evolved. She began mentoring new arrivals, teaching them the intricate balance of skill, empathy, and composure required to survive and serve on the front lines. Her lessons were not in textbooks, but in action. how to stay calm when panic threatened, how to offer hope when all seemed lost, and how to find strength within oneself when fear screamed the loudest. Volunteers learned not only how to perform medical tasks, but how to embody courage under fire. Yet the war continued to escalate. One night, a sudden bombardment shook the city, sending debris and chaos into the streets. Ruth, without hesitation, led the volunteers to protect the wounded, stabilize critical patients, and keep the hospital operational despite the terror outside. Her calm authority became a lifeline, a steady anchor in a sea of destruction. Soldiers and volunteers alike drew strength from her example, relying on her courage as much on her skills. Even in moments of exhaustion, Ruth found brief pauses to reflect. Letters from home reminded her of the life she had left behind, the warmth of family, the laughter of friends, and the normalcy she would never fully experience until the war ended. These memories fueled her determination, giving her the emotional endurance needed to continue day after day. By the end of autumn, Ruth Sanders had become more than a nurse or a volunteer. She had become a symbol of hope and resilience. Her presence transformed the hospital, turning chaos into order, despair into courage, and suffering into care. Soldiers whispered her name in quiet gratitude. Volunteers emulated her methods, and even the officers recognized that her influence extended far beyond what could be measured in official reports. And yet, Ruth knew the war would continue to demand more. The front lines were far from stable, and every day brought new challenges, new crises, and new tests of resolve. But through it all, one truth remained unshaken. Ruth Sanders, hidden hero of the front lines, would face each challenge with unwavering courage, compassion, and determination, leaving an indelible mark on everyone fortunate enough to cross her path. Winter returned, harsher than the last, blanketing the devastated city in cold and frost. Inside the hospital tents, Ruth Sanders moved with the same relentless dedication she had shown since her first day. The biting cold outside seemed to make the wounded even more vulnerable, their injuries worsened by exposure and exhaustion. Ruth's hands were steady, her mind alert, her heart unwavering. She had become the lifeblood of the tent, the quiet force that kept hope alive in a world that seemed determined to crush it. The challenges were relentless. Supplies ran dangerously low, and every decision Ruth made carried life or death consequences. Volunteers looked to her for guidance, soldiers relied on her steadiness, and even the officers who once doubted the impact of women on the front lines began to recognize her extraordinary influence. Ruth approached every crisis with calm precision, transforming panic into action and fear into resilience. One particularly bitter evening, a convoy of critically wounded soldiers arrived unexpectedly from a battle that had erupted overnight. Many were in shock, some unresponsive, their bodies battered beyond recognition. Ruth sprang into action, delegating tasks, performing life-saving procedures herself, and offering words of reassurance that carried more weight than any orders could. Every second mattered, and Ruth's presence ensured that hope survived amidst the chaos. The emotional toll was immense. Every life Ruth touched carried a story of fear, loss, and courage. Soldiers confided their deepest anxieties to her, and volunteers leaned on her guidance to process their own trauma. Ruth listened, comforted, and carried the weight of their collective suffering as if it were her own, never allowing despair to overshadow the critical work at hand. Each night she fell into brief, exhausted slumber, only to arise again with the same unwavering resolve. Her influence extended beyond immediate medical care. Ruth began training volunteers not only in technical skills, but in the delicate art of compassion under pressure. She taught them how to remain calm when everything around them threatened to collapse, how to provide reassurance to terrified soldiers, and how to instill hope when all seemed lost. Under her guidance, the hospital became a sanctuary of resilience and humanity, a place where courage was nurtured and fear was met with strength. The war showed no mercy, and Ruth faced moments that would test her like never before. One night, an air raid struck unexpectedly, shaking the city and sending debris crashing through the tents. Ruth, despite exhaustion and fear, directed volunteers to secure patients, stabilize the wounded, and maintain order amidst the chaos. Her calm authority and decisiveness saved countless lives that night, reinforcing the quiet legend that had begun to grow around her name. Even as winter dragged on, letters from home reminded Ruth of the life she had paused. Each message carried joy, longing, and sorrow, news of family, friends, and small moments from a world that continued to exist beyond the front lines. Ruth drew strength from these connections, even as she remained wholly focused on the immediate demands of her work. Every life she saved, every moment of courage she inspired, was a testament to her belief in the enduring power of human resilience. By the end of this harsh winter, Ruth Sanders had proven once again that courage was not loud or celebrated. It was quiet, consistent, and deeply human. Soldiers whispered her name with gratitude. Volunteers emulated her steadfast example, and the officers who once doubted her influence now understood the invaluable role she played. Her impact extended far beyond the walls of the hospital tents, touching countless lives and shaping the war effort in ways that would never be fully recorded. And yet Ruth knew that the front lines were far from quiet. The months ahead promised new battles, new crises, and further tests of courage. But one truth remained unshaken. Ruth Sanders, hidden heroine of the front lines, would continue to stand, to guide, and to inspire, a beacon of hope in a world consumed by war.
Spring returned again, bringing the faint promise of renewal, but the war showed no mercy. Streets were still scarred, buildings reduced to rubble, and the cries of those affected by battle filled the air. Yet, within the hospital tents, Ruth Sanders moved with a quiet determination that inspired everyone around her. She had become the heartbeat of the operation, the unseen force that transformed chaos into care, fear into courage, and despair into hope. This season brought an unprecedented challenge, an overwhelming wave of injured soldiers from a massive offensive. The hospital tents were overflowing. Every available bed was occupied, supplies were stretched thin, and exhaustion pressed heavily on volunteers. Ruth, however, remained unshaken. Her mind raced, organizing the wounded, delegating critical tasks, and performing life-saving procedures with a precision born of countless days on the front lines. She became both guide and shield, ensuring that every soldier received attention, comfort, and dignity. Among the new arrivals was a young soldier, barely 16, his eyes wide with terror and disbelief. Ruth knelt beside him, gently adjusting his blankets and whispering reassurance. "You're not alone. We'll get through this together," she told him. It was in these small, intimate moments that Ruth's true power was revealed. Her ability to meet fear with compassion, trauma with understanding, and hopelessness with unwavering strength. Her leadership extended beyond medical care. Volunteers, exhausted and overwhelmed, looked to her for guidance and inspiration. Ruth trained them not only in skill, but in the subtle, essential art of emotional resilience. She taught them how to maintain composure, how to instill hope, and how to become quiet pillars of strength for the soldiers who depended on them. Under her direction, the hospital became more than a place of healing. It became a sanctuary where courage and humanity were carefully nurtured amidst the relentless tide of war.
The emotional toll was immense. Ruth witnessed deaths that no words could describe, injuries that tested the limits of medical knowledge, and fear that threatened to consume everyone in its path. Yet she never wavered. She carried each moment with grace, her focus unwavering, her resolve absolute. For Ruth, heroism was not about recognition or accolades. It was about the quiet, consistent choice to act, to save, to comfort, and to inspire. Then came an unexpected crisis. A direct bombardment struck near the hospital, shaking the ground and sending debris through the tents. Volunteers froze in panic, soldiers cried out in fear, and chaos threatened to consume the carefully maintained order. Ruth's presence, calm and commanding, cut through the turmoil. She directed the team to secure the wounded, stabilize critical patients, and maintain control, and saved countless lives that night, solidifying her reputation as the unseen backbone of the front lines. Even amidst these crises, Ruth drew moments of strength from her connection to home. Letters carried news of family, laughter, and the normalcy of life beyond the war. Each word reminded her of what she had sacrificed, yet also reinforced her belief that her work mattered, that the courage, hope, and humanity she brought to the front lines could ripple far beyond the tents, touching lives in ways no one could fully measure. By the end of this spring, Ruth Sanders had achieved what few could. Soldiers whispered her name with reverence, volunteers emulated her example, and even the officers acknowledged the critical role she played. Her presence had become a stabilizing force in a world consumed by chaos, a reminder that courage, empathy, and determination could endure even in the darkest of times. The emotional toll was immense. Ruth witnessed deaths that no words could describe, injuries that tested the limits of medical knowledge, and fear that threatened to consume everyone in its path. Yet she never wavered. She carried each moment with grace, her focus unwavering, her resolve absolute. For Ruth, heroism was not about recognition or accolades. It was about the quiet, consistent choice to act, to save, to comfort, and to inspire. Then came an unexpected crisis. A direct bombardment struck near the hospital, shaking the ground and sending debris through the tents. Volunteers froze in panic, soldiers cried out in fear, and chaos threatened to consume the carefully maintained order. Ruth's presence, calm and commanding, cut through the turmoil. She directed the team to secure the wounded, stabilize critical patients, and maintain control. Her decisiveness saved countless lives that night, solidifying her reputation as the unseen backbone of the front lines. Even amidst these crises, Ruth drew moments of strength from her connection to home. Letters carried news of family, laughter, and the normalcy of life beyond the war. Each word reminded her of what she had sacrificed, yet also reinforced her belief that her work mattered, that the courage, hope, and humanity she brought to the front lines could ripple far beyond the tents, touching lives in ways no one could fully measure. By the end of this spring, Ruth Sanders had achieved what few could. Soldiers whispered her name with reverence, volunteers emulated her example, and even the officers acknowledged the critical role she played. Her presence had become a stabilizing force in a world consumed by chaos. A reminder that courage, empathy, and determination could endure even in the darkest of times. Yet Ruth knew that the war's challenges were far from over. Each day promised new battles, more wounded, and further tests of endurance and resilience. But one truth remained constant. Ruth Sanders, hidden hero of the front lines, would continue to stand, to guide, and to inspire, leaving an indelible mark on every life she touched and proving that even amidst destruction, hope could flourish. By the time summer approached once again, Ruth Sanders had become a legend among those who knew her story, though the wider world remained unaware of her deeds. Her hands had healed countless soldiers, her voice had calmed terrified hearts, and her courage had inspired an entire network of volunteers to rise beyond their own fears. Yet Ruth remained humble, never seeking recognition, content to act quietly, faithfully, and relentlessly. The war was far from over. The front lines were shifting, battles intensifying, and new waves of wounded continued to arrive daily. But Ruth's presence had transformed the hospital into a place of resilience. Volunteers followed her lead, soldiers trusted her judgment, and even the officers came to rely on her unwavering steadiness. She had become the invisible backbone of the effort, a quiet force whose influence stretched far beyond what anyone could measure. One morning, news came of an urgent mission. A convoy carrying critical supplies for the front lines had been trapped behind enemy lines. The hospital risked running out of essential resources, which could mean disaster for those depending on Ruth's care. Without hesitation, she coordinated a plan, mobilizing volunteers to retrieve and transport the supplies under dangerous conditions. Her decisive action not only averted a crisis, but ensured the hospital remained fully operational for weeks to come. It was a reminder that courage and ingenuity, combined with determination, could bend even the harshest circumstances. Yet Ruth's heroism was never only about strategy or skill. It was about the human connections she nurtured. Soldiers confided in her, trusting her with fears they could not share with anyone else. Volunteers looked to her as a model of calm, empathy, and resilience. Every word she spoke, every action she took, rippled far beyond her immediate presence, shaping lives, inspiring courage, and quietly rewriting what it meant to serve on the front lines. As the months passed, Ruth began to witness the tangible impact of her efforts. Soldiers recovered under her care, returning to the field with renewed hope. Volunteers became skilled, compassionate leaders themselves, carrying forward the lessons she had instilled. Letters from families began to pour in, filled with gratitude for the unseen hero who had saved their loved ones. And yet, Ruth continued her work quietly, focusing on the lives still in her care rather than seeking praise. The culmination of Ruth's service came during a particularly harrowing offensive. The casualties were overwhelming, the chaos unrelenting, and the stakes higher than ever. Yet Ruth, as always, moved with unwavering precision and empathy. She triaged, treated, comforted, and inspired, all while navigating the dangers of the front line. Her presence became a symbol of hope for soldiers, a stabilizing force for volunteers, and a reminder to all that even in war, humanity could endure. By the time the war began to wind down, Ruth Sanders' name was known intimately by hundreds of soldiers and volunteers whose lives she had touched. Though the wider world would never fully recognize her heroism, those who survived carried her courage forward, and her legacy became woven into the very fabric of the front lines she had served so tirelessly. She had proven that bravery was not always loud, that heroism could be quiet, and that a single determined woman could make an impact immeasurable in its reach. Ruth Sanders returned home a changed woman. Her experiences had left scars, yes, but also a profound understanding of human resilience, courage, and compassion. She had been hidden from the public eye, yet her story lived in every soldier saved, every volunteer inspired, and every life touched by her presence. She was a reminder that sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones who act without applause, without recognition, and without expectation. Heroes who change the world quietly, one life at a time. And so, the story of Ruth Sanders, hidden heroine of the front lines, stands as a testament to the unyielding strength of the human spirit, the power of quiet courage, and the enduring impact of compassion amidst the darkest chapters of history. She had become more than a nurse, more than a volunteer. She had become hope itself, and her legacy would endure long after the guns fell silent.